Hello family, welcome to Jimmy Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like, leave your thoughts on the comments section, and also share this video. It means the world to us. Thank you as you do so. Now sit back and relax as we dive into this thrilling story briefly. Judith Grant sat quietly in the back seat of the sleek, black limousine, her hands resting on her lap as her fingers gently brushed over the smooth fabric of her navy blue evening gown. The dress fit her perfectly, its floor-length design hugging her figure with understated elegance. Her hair was styled in a neat updo, with only a few loose strands framing her face, adding a soft touch to her otherwise composed demeanor. Despite her graceful appearance, Judith's mind was anything but calm. As the car hummed along the road, she stared out of the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had endured, who had rebuilt herself after years of feeling small and unseen. Tonight, however, she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. The invitation from her ex-husband, Thomas, had been completely unexpected. "Madam, we'll be arriving shortly," the driver announced politely from the front seat, breaking the silence. Judith nodded. "Thank you, Idris," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, but inside, her thoughts churned. Why now? She wondered for the 10th time since she'd received the message. What could Thomas possibly want? Their divorce had been finalized years ago, and she had worked hard to distance herself from the toxic shadows of that chapter in her life. Yet, here she was, on her way to meet not just Thomas, but also his mother, Karen, the woman who had been her harshest critic during their marriage. She could still hear Karen's voice echoing in her memory, sharp and condescending. "Judith, you'll never be good enough for my son. You're lucky he even married you." The words had stung back then, but tonight, they only fueled her resolve. Judith let out a small sigh, glancing at the pearl bracelet on her wrist. It was a gift from her late father, a reminder of the strength he always believed she had. She straightened her posture and looked ahead, determined to handle whatever awaited her. As the limousine pulled up to the upscale restaurant, its grand facade illuminated by warm, golden lights, Judith felt her heart skip a beat. The doorman stepped forward, opening the car door with a respectful bow. "Good evening, ma'am," he greeted her, extending a hand to help her out of the car. Judith smiled politely and stepped onto the pavement, her heels clicking against the ground. "Good evening," she replied. As she smoothed the front of her gown, she caught her reflection in the restaurant's glass doors. She looked calm, poised, and unshaken, the exact opposite of how she felt inside. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was luxurious and refined. Soft music played in the background, blending with the hum of low conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses. The scent of freshly baked bread and aromatic spices filled the air. Judith's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Thomas, who was seated at a corner table near the large windows. Beside him was Karen, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Judith took a deep breath and walked toward them, her steps measured and deliberate. As she approached, Thomas stood up, his signature smirk playing on his lips. "Judith," he greeted, his voice smooth, but carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite place. "You look stunning." Judith forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Thomas. It's been a while." Karen, still seated, looked Judith up and down before speaking. I see you've learned to dress appropriately. That's an improvement." Judith's smile tightened, but she refused to let Karen's comment rattle her. "Good evening, Karen. It's nice to see you again." Karen raised an eyebrow, but said nothing further. Thomas gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Please, sit. I ordered your favorite wine, Chardonnay, wasn't it?" Judith hesitated for a moment before lowering herself gracefully into the chair. She noticed how Thomas seemed overly confident, his demeanor almost rehearsed. Karen, on the other hand, watched her like a hawk, her gaze sharp and unkind. "Thank you for the invitation," Judith began, her voice calm but firm. "I must admit, I was surprised to hear from you." Thomas leaned back in his chair, a glass of red wine in his hand. "Well, I thought it was time we had a proper conversation. It's been years, after all." Judith tilted her head slightly. And what exactly did you want to discuss? Before Thomas could respond, Karen interjected, her tone dripping with passive aggression. It's about time we all moved past certain things. Don't you think, Judith? Judith met Karen's gaze head-on. I agree. Moving past things is important, especially when they no longer serve us. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, clearly not expecting such a direct response. Thomas chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. Let's not make this evening about old grievances, he said smoothly. We're here to enjoy good food and good company. Judith resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Thomas's charm had always been his weapon of choice, but she was no longer the same woman who fell for it. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her expression unreadable. So, Thomas began, leaning forward slightly, how have you been? I've heard you've been keeping busy. I have, Judith replied simply. Life has been good. Karen scoffed softly, just loud enough for Judith to hear. Well, that's a surprise. Judith turned to Karen, her voice calm but edged with steel. Why would that surprise you, Karen? Did you expect me to fall apart? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Thomas quickly intervened. Now, let's not turn this into a debate, he said, flashing his signature smile. We're all adults here. Judith's gaze shifted back to Thomas. Exactly. Which is why I'd like to know why I'm here. Thomas hesitated, swirling his wine glass as if searching for the right words. I thought it would be nice for us to reconnect. To clear the air. Judith arched an eyebrow. Reconnect? After all this time? Karen sighed dramatically. Judith, must you always be so difficult? Thomas is trying to be kind. Judith's eyes never left Thomas's face. I'm just trying to understand the purpose of this meeting. That's all. The tension at the table was palpable, but Judith remained composed, her years of rebuilding herself evident in her demeanor. She wasn't here to play their games. She was here to face whatever they had planned, and she was ready. The waiter arrived at that moment, breaking the awkward silence. Good evening. Are you ready to order, or shall I give you a few more minutes? Thomas glanced at Judith. Ladies first. Judith offered the waiter a polite smile. I'll have the grilled salmon with a side of roasted vegetables, please. Excellent choice, the waiter replied before turning to Thomas and Karen for their orders. As the waiter walked away, Judith took a sip of the Chardonnay that had been poured for her. The crisp, familiar taste reminded her of the many dinners she'd endured during her marriage, dinners where she'd felt small, unimportant. But not tonight. Tonight, she was determined to hold her own. Thomas studied her for a moment, his smirk fading slightly. You've changed, Judith. Judith set her glass down, meeting his gaze. I had to. The restaurant's refined ambience buzzed softly with the low murmur of diners enjoying their meals. Judith walked toward the corner table, her every step deliberate and steady, even as her mind raced with thoughts. Thomas stood up as she approached, a confident smirk plastered across his face, and Karen remained seated, her lips pursed into a tight line of disapproval. Judith, Thomas said, spreading his arms in a show of exaggerated warmth. You made it. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind. Judith offered him a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm not in the habit of backing out of commitments, Thomas. Her gaze shifted briefly to Karen, who gave her a curt nod but didn't rise from her chair. Good evening, Karen, Judith said evenly. Karen's eyes flicked over Judith's appearance, taking in her elegant gown and flawless posture. Judith, she replied, her voice sharp but controlled. You look different. I suppose you put some effort into yourself for a change. Judith felt the subtle sting of Karen's words, but refused to let them penetrate her composure. Thank you, she replied calmly, her tone giving nothing away. It's good to see you, too. Thomas gestured toward the chair opposite him. Please, sit. We've been waiting for you. Judith lowered herself into the chair with grace, placing her small clutch on the table. As she adjusted herself, she noticed Karen's eyes still lingering on her, as though searching for something to criticize. Judith met her gaze briefly, before turning her attention to Thomas, who had already begun pouring her a glass of wine. Chardonnay, Thomas said, setting the glass in front of her. Your favorite, right? Judith glanced at the glass, but didn't pick it up immediately. You remembered. Thomas chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Of course I did. There are some things you don't forget. Karen made a small sound in the back of her throat, almost like a scoff, but she quickly masked it with a sip of her own wine. Judith caught the gesture and decided to let it slide. She wasn't here to engage in petty battles, especially not with Karen. So, Judith, Karen began, her tone deceptively sweet, how has life been treating you? It's been, 3 years since the divorce? 4, Judith corrected her, her voice steady. And life has been good, thank you for asking. Karen raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Good? That's interesting. I always wondered how you'd manage on your own. Thomas chuckled softly, clearly amused by his mother's comment. Judith, however, remained unfazed. I managed just fine, she said, meeting Karen's gaze without flinching. In fact, I've been thriving. The smirk on Karen's face faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. Well, that's surprising. I suppose you must have found some way to get by. Thomas, sensing the tension, decided to steer the conversation in a different direction. Judith, he began, his tone light and casual, you'll be pleased to know that business has been going incredibly well. The company's profits have doubled in the past year alone. That's great to hear, Judith replied, her tone neutral. She knew Thomas well enough to recognize when he was fishing for praise or admiration. Thomas leaned forward slightly, a hint of smugness creeping into his expression. It wasn't easy, of course. But with the right decisions, and the right people, I was able to turn things around. It's a shame we couldn't achieve this kind of success when we were together. Judith's lips pressed into a thin line, but she refused to rise to the bait. I'm glad things are working out for you, she said simply. Karen chimed in, her voice dripping with faux concern. It's true, Judith. Thomas has really come into his own since you two went your separate ways. Don't you think so? Judith glanced at Karen, her expression calm but unreadable. It's good to hear he's doing well, she replied. Everyone deserves success. Karen gave a small, satisfied smile, as though she'd scored a point in some unspoken game. Judith, however, refused to play along. She picked up her glass of wine and took a slow sip, using the moment to collect her thoughts. Thomas, emboldened by Karen's support, continued. It's not just business either. I've been working on myself, too. A new gym routine, a better diet, even some meditation here and there. You know, self-improvement. That's wonderful, Thomas, Judith said, her tone polite but distant. I'm glad you're taking care of yourself. Thomas studied her for a moment, his smirk fading slightly. You're awfully quiet tonight, Judith. I was expecting more enthusiasm. Judith set her glass down and looked at him directly. I'm just listening, Thomas. I'm here to hear what you have to say. Her words seemed to catch him off guard, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Karen, however, was quick to fill the silence. Judith, she said, leaning forward slightly, I must admit, I didn't expect you to accept Thomas's invitation. It's not like you to be so agreeable. Judith turned to Karen, her expression calm but firm. I accepted because I thought it might be an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation. I didn't come here to argue or revisit the past. Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. How mature of you. Judith held her gaze. Thank you. I've learned a lot in the past few years. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Judith refused to let it affect her. She could feel the weight of Karen's scrutiny and the subtle smugness in Thomas's demeanor, but she remained composed, her resolve unshaken. A waiter approached the table, breaking the silence. Good evening. Have you decided on your orders, or would you like a few more minutes? Thomas gestured for the waiter to wait. Judith, would you like to go first? Judith nodded politely. I'll have the grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, please. An excellent choice, the waiter said with a smile, jotting down her order. He turned to Karen and Thomas, who quickly placed their orders as well. As the waiter walked away, Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Judith, I have to say, you've changed. There's something different about you. Judith tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. Change is inevitable, Thomas. Especially when you've had time to reflect and grow. Karen snorted softly, covering it with a sip of her wine. Judith ignored her, keeping her focus on Thomas. Well, Thomas said, forcing a smile, I hope this evening can be a step toward rebuilding bridges. Judith's eyes narrowed slightly. Rebuilding bridges? I wasn't aware any bridges were left standing. The comment hung in the air, and for the first time that evening, Thomas looked uncertain. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her usual confidence faltering under Judith's unwavering composure. Judith took another sip of her wine, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotion swirling beneath the surface. She didn't know exactly what Thomas and Karen were planning, but one thing was clear, she wasn't going to let them dictate the narrative. Not anymore. The main course had just been served, and the scent of Judith's grilled salmon filled the air, mingling with the murmurs of conversation around the restaurant. Judith carefully sliced her fish, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, even as she felt the tension rising at the table. Thomas had been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, and Karen wore a faint, smug smile that hinted at a storm brewing. Judith glanced up, her eyes locking with Thomas's. Something on your mind, Thomas? She asked, her tone even and calm. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. He swirled the wine in his glass, before setting it down on the table with a deliberate clink. You know, Judith, he began, his voice just loud enough to carry beyond their table, it's funny how life works, isn't it? You think you know someone, you give them everything, and yet somehow, they still manage to let you down. Judith paused mid-cut, her knife still poised over her plate. She looked at him steadily, refusing to rise to the bait. I'm not sure what you mean, Thomas, she replied. Oh, come on, Thomas said, chuckling lightly, though the sound lacked warmth. Let's not pretend here. I mean, we're all adults, aren't we? He glanced around the room theatrically, drawing the attention of a few nearby diners. Why don't we just call things as they are? Judith set her utensils down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. If you have something to say, Thomas, just say it. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. All right, since you insist. Let's talk about the past, shall we? Let's talk about how hard it was to build my business while constantly being held back by someone who didn't believe in me. Karen let out a sharp laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh, Thomas, you're being too kind. Judith didn't just not believe in you, she dragged you down. Judith's chest tightened, but her expression remained neutral. She sat up straighter in her chair, her gaze flicking between Thomas and Karen. I see. This is why you invited me tonight. Oh, don't be so defensive, Judith, Karen chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. Thomas is simply being honest. You can't deny that you were never really supportive. Isn't that true? Judith took a slow sip of her wine, the glass steady in her hand despite the fire simmering within her. She placed it back on the table carefully, her calm demeanor unnerving Thomas, whose smirk began to falter. I remember things a little differently, Judith said softly. But please, go on. Thomas seemed momentarily thrown by her composure, but quickly recovered. Differently? Oh, Judith, don't rewrite history. You were always so critical, always doubting every decision I made. You never had faith in me. Judith tilted her head slightly. Is that what you believe? It's not just what I believe, it's the truth, Thomas shot back, his voice rising slightly. Heads turned at nearby tables, diners subtly glancing over as the tension at their table became impossible to ignore. Karen, emboldened by the attention, leaned in. "Let's not forget, Judith, how ungrateful you were. Thomas gave you everything, this lifestyle, the house, everything you could have wanted, and you still managed to push him away." A murmur rippled through the room as more diners tuned into the escalating conversation. Judith felt the weight of their stares, but refused to let it faze her. She reached for her water glass, taking a deliberate sip, before setting it down again. "I see you've both decided to air your grievances tonight," Judith said, her voice calm and measured. "It's fascinating how selective memory can be." Thomas's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Selective memory? Oh, that's rich coming from you. Do you even realize how much I sacrificed for us?" "For you?" Judith's eyes darkened, though her expression remained composed. "You're right, Thomas," she said quietly. "You did sacrifice a lot. But let's not forget who stood by you during the years you were building your business, who supported you when things were falling apart." Karen scoffed loudly, shaking her head. "Oh, please, Judith. Supporting him? You? If anything, you were a liability." At this point, the murmurs in the restaurant grew louder. Judith noticed a waiter hovering nearby, uncertain whether to intervene or let the scene play out. Judith, however, kept her gaze locked on Thomas, her calm silence making him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You know," Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it's no wonder things ended the way they did. You were always so difficult. Impossible to please." Judith's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp. "Interesting. I don't recall you saying that when you were signing the divorce papers." The subtle jab landed squarely, and Thomas's expression hardened. Karen leaned forward, her tone biting. "Judith, must you always play the victim? Thomas did everything for you, and yet you—" "I what, Karen?" Judith interrupted, her voice finally gaining an edge. "Please, enlighten me." Karen faltered, clearly not expecting Judith to push back so directly. The sudden silence was palpable, broken only by the soft clinking of glasses and the occasional whisper from nearby diners. "I'm not sure what you both hoped to achieve by this little performance," Judith continued, her voice steady. "But let me make one thing clear, I'm not the woman you used to know. And if you think you can humiliate me into silence, you're mistaken." The firmness in her tone seemed to knock the wind out of both Thomas and Karen. Judith leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table as she regarded them with a calm, almost detached expression. Thomas opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, the confidence draining from his face as he realized the tables had turned. Karen, for once, seemed at a loss for words, her usual sharpness dulled by Judith's unflinching resolve. Around them, the whispers grew louder, and Judith could feel the collective judgment of the room settling on Thomas and Karen. The waiter, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped forward hesitantly. "Is everything all right here, ma'am?" he asked, addressing Judith directly. Judith smiled up at him. "Yes, thank you. Everything is just fine." The waiter nodded and stepped back, though he continued to hover nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Judith turned her attention back to Thomas and Karen, her calm smile never wavering. "If this is all you wanted to discuss," she said, rising gracefully from her seat, "then I believe this dinner is over." Thomas stared at her, his expression a mixture of frustration and regret. Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but Judith didn't give her the chance. She picked up her clutch, adjusted the strap of her gown, and turned toward the door. As she walked away, the murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, and she could feel the weight of every eye on her. But Judith didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had been sent, loud and clear. Judith sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the table, her face calm and composed, despite the storm brewing around her. Thomas's smug smirk had grown wider after his pointed jabs, and Karen's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as though she believed Judith had been successfully put in her place. The whispers from nearby tables buzzed faintly, but Judith didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath, leaned forward slightly, and began to speak. Thomas, she said softly, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable strength, it's interesting how selective your memory has become. You sit here, portraying yourself as the perfect husband who sacrificed so much, while I was the cause of your struggles. But let's not rewrite history, shall we? Her words cut through the tension like a blade. Thomas's smirk faltered, and Karen's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. Judith continued, her tone steady but growing firmer with every word. Do you remember when you first had the idea to start your business? You were unsure, hesitant, even scared of failing. And who was it that stayed up with you every night, going over plans, reviewing budgets, and encouraging you to take that leap? Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judith, that's not. No, she interrupted, holding up a hand. Let me finish. Karen opened her mouth to object, but Judith turned to her with a pointed look. And you, Karen. Do you remember how often you'd call Thomas to discourage him, telling him it was too risky, that he was wasting time and money? I was the one who stood by him, the one who believed in him when no one else did. Including you. The room seemed to grow quieter as nearby diners leaned in, pretending not to listen but clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. Judith, Thomas said, his voice uneasy, that's not entirely fair. Fair? Judith repeated, her voice rising just enough to command attention without losing its calm edge. You want to talk about fair? Let's talk about how I worked 2 jobs to support us while you invested every penny we had into that business. Let's talk about how I paid our rent, our bills, and still found the energy to help you build your dream. Karen's mouth tightened, her usual confidence visibly shaken. Judith, no one is denying that you helped, but. But what, Karen? Judith asked, fixing her with a piercing gaze. Does my contribution not count because I wasn't the one signing deals or making public appearances? Or is it because you've always chosen to see me as less than, no matter what I did? The color drained from Karen's face, and for once, she was silent. Judith turned back to Thomas, her voice softening but losing none of its power. And you, Thomas, want to paint me as the villain in our story. But tell me this, who stayed when you doubted yourself? Who encouraged you when you felt like giving up? Who celebrated your wins and comforted you during your losses? It wasn't just me standing by you, it was me sacrificing my dreams for yours. Thomas's face was flushed now, his bravado completely gone. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to struggle to find the words. Judith didn't give him the chance. And let's not forget, she continued, her tone sharpening again, that even after the divorce, I didn't air our dirty laundry. I didn't drag your name through the mud, though I had every right to. I took my dignity and walked away quietly. But now, you bring me here, to a public place, to humiliate me? Her words hung in the air, like a hammer striking an anvil. The whispers around the room had stopped entirely, and the silence was deafening. Judith leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but unyielding. If you think you can define me by our past, you're wrong. I'm not the woman you used to know. I'd built a life for myself, on my own. I've achieved more than you or anyone else ever gave me credit for. Thomas looked away, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth as though it might save him. Karen's hands fidgeted in her lap, her usual sharp tongue failing her in the face of Judith's quiet power. Judith glanced around briefly, noticing the subtle nods and encouraging looks from some of the other diners. One woman at a nearby table even gave her a small, approving smile. She returned her gaze to Thomas, her voice dropping to a softer, almost gentle tone. I came here tonight hoping for a civilized conversation, but I see now that was too much to expect. So let me make this clear, I will not let you or anyone else diminish what I've done or who I am. Not anymore. A faint ripple of applause broke out from one corner of the restaurant, and though it wasn't loud, its impact was undeniable. Judith didn't acknowledge it, keeping her focus on Thomas and Karen, who looked as though they wanted to disappear into their seats. With that, Judith stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She picked up her clutch and adjusted the strap of her gown, her head held high. Enjoy the rest of your evening, she said simply, her tone polite but firm. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The quiet murmur of admiration followed her as she left, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The restaurant grew quieter as Judith's figure disappeared through the grand doors, her exit leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Thomas stared at the empty chair where she had sat just moments ago, his once confident demeanor replaced with a mixture of embarrassment and unease. Karen, too, was unusually quiet, her sharp tongue silenced for the first time in years. Around them, the faint murmurs of other diners slowly resumed, but the weight of the evening's events hung heavily in the air. Thomas shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the half-empty wine glass in front of him. For years, he had convinced himself that Judith was the problem, the obstacle that had held him back. Tonight, however, her words had cut through his narrative like a knife. Every sacrifice she mentioned, every moment she had stood by him, played back in his mind like a film reel. He sighed heavily, breaking the silence. I didn't think she'd say all that. Karen frowned, her pride wounded but her thoughts visibly troubled. She certainly has a way with words, she muttered, though her usual venom was absent. Thomas rubbed his temples, his voice tinged with frustration. It's not just what she said, it's the truth. I thought I could bring her here and, I don't know, show her that I've moved on. But instead, he trailed off, the regret evident in his tone. Karen looked at her son, her expression softening for a moment. Thomas, you didn't have to humiliate her to prove a point. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. And yet, that's exactly what I tried to do. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping. She was right, you know. About everything. She supported me when no one else did, including you. Karen stiffened slightly at his words, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared down at her hands, her mind replaying Judith's sharp yet truthful remarks. For years, she had convinced herself that Judith was unworthy of her son, that she wasn't good enough for the Grant family. But tonight, Karen had seen a side of Judith she had never truly acknowledged, strong, resilient, and dignified. She's changed, Karen admitted quietly, her voice uncharacteristically soft. She's not the same timid woman I used to know. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes distant. She's more than changed, Mom. She's better. Better than I gave her credit for. Better than I ever was to her. The admission hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Karen tapped her manicured nails against the edge of her glass, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being a strong and opinionated woman, but Judith's words had struck a nerve. Karen had spent years criticizing and undermining her, but now, for the first time, she was forced to confront the possibility that she had been wrong. Thomas broke the silence again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I expected tonight. Maybe I thought if I could tear her down, I'd feel better about myself. But it didn't work. It just made me feel small. Karen looked at her son, her expression softening further. You underestimated her, she said simply. Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. I did. And now, she's gone, and I don't think there's anything I can do to fix it. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Judith stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed as the cool night breeze played with the loose strands of her hair. Her limousine had yet to arrive, but she didn't mind the wait. For the first time in years, she felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had faced her past head-on and emerged stronger for it. As she looked up at the stars scattered across the night sky, Judith smiled to herself. She didn't need validation from Thomas or Karen. She didn't need their approval or their apologies. Her worth wasn't tied to their opinions, and tonight had solidified that truth. When her limousine finally pulled up, the driver stepped out and opened the door for her. Everything all right, madam? He asked politely. Judith nodded, her smile warm but resolute. Yes, Idris. Everything is more than all right. She stepped into the car, the soft leather seats embracing her as she leaned back and closed her eyes. The memories of the evening replayed in her mind, but instead of anger or sadness, all she felt was peace. She was free from their toxic influence, free from the doubts that had once held her back, and free to move forward with her life. Back in the restaurant, Thomas and Karen sat in silence, their plates untouched and their confidence shattered. The echoes of Judith's words lingered in their minds, forcing them to confront the truth about their own actions. Karen finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Maybe we were too harsh on her. On everything. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him with eyes full of regret. It's too late for maybe, Mom. She's gone, and I don't blame her. As the waiter approached to clear their table, Thomas sighed heavily, knowing he had lost something far greater than he ever realized. Judith's strength, her dignity, and her refusal to be diminished had left an indelible mark, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed her grace that evening.